Welcome to the first Learn from the Masters deep dive. We're working with domains today, which is Jaspersoft's metadata layer on top of your client or your data that we want to do analytics on. My name is Jason Huber. On the webinar with me, we have Alan Kavanagh, who's our new head of marketing. He'll be with us here shortly, I presume. A little awkward, a bit about me. I've been with Jaspersoft for about 3 years, over 3 years. A lot of you know me. I recognize your names in the attendees list. And I worked with professional services for about the past 2.5 years. So I've done about 100 different implementations of Jaspersoft, everything from SSO to, of course, domains and custom reportings as well. I work now as a solutions consultant. So some of you know me on the decision-making side, or help you decide how Jaspersoft can fit in your application, how we can work with the organization, help you provide BI to your customers or internal, depending on your use case. I did work as a former professor. They always like to add this stuff in. I have my PhD in education. I worked as a professor at a few universities here. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I did that for about 12 years, teaching computer science. And then I decided to go back into the private sector, which we'll see if that was a good decision or not. You guys can let me know. So let's start with the review of what's a domain. And we know a lot of you have worked with Jaspersoft, sometimes longer than me, or in a lot of cases longer than I have. And sometimes you use domains immediately, and every once in a while we have clients that use domains after they've used Jaspersoft for a number of years, or maybe you have yet to use domains, but you've certainly heard of what they are, seen them in demos, and experienced maybe what their potential is. Let's take a few minutes here to level set on what domains are used for and what the possibilities are, and then we'll talk about a couple specific deep dive topics on security and some things like that. The first thing we have is, of course, it's a metadata layer on top of your data. So it provides this abstraction layer. And what I like to say is a lot of our consumers, our users of our application, don't have the expertise, the time, the patience, whatever you want to call it, to look at our relational databases or our NoSQL databases or our big data stores and say, how do these tables relate? How do these fields work with each other? What aggregations are appropriate? Things like that they don't want to spend the time to do. And domains allow us to do that, provide an easy access to our data, flatten it a little bit if you want to talk about normalization of data, and do some aggregation as well. But we can also secure that data. We can also join those tables for them. We can also provide a completely different view into our data to our consumers if we want to through a domain. So it really lets us do a lot of different things to our data. And you see the different pieces we have on the screen. We have a bunch of databases, maybe multiple databases. One of the things we'll touch on today are virtual data sources, which allow you to take maybe an Oracle database, a SQL Server database, a NoSQL database, or a big data MongoDB, and combine those into a single data store for your consumers. But typically we have some tables. We want to join those. Maybe we want to apply some filters to those, maybe limit the data to a certain region or a certain area, certain time frame. We can add some calculated fields, sum the data, aggregate the data in some other way, average it, that sort of thing. We'll spend more time on today talking about some functionality and some programming on domains is security. We can secure that data. A lot of times our clients do have security built into their, let's say, SQL Server database, but other times not so much, or there's another layer of security that the business wants to add. Maybe just protect users from seeing data they shouldn't see, or just save them time by limiting the data to what they are supposed to be looking at primarily. And we can do that through security. We'll look at a few ways, and we'll see how the door is wide open to what we can do with that security model. Display and localization. We can localize our data by putting in a localization file, very simple key value pair format, and have our field names, our table names, etc., localized by region or by country, by user setting or by attribute. But at the end of the day, we're trying to provide this business-friendly view of your data to non-technical users. And what that means is, again, going back to your typical end user needs to go in there. They want to manipulate the data. They want to drag and drop some fields. They don't want to worry about joins or aggregations. They want all that done for them. And domains give you the ability to provide your users that access very, very quickly. And in a nice GUI. I really enjoy the domain designer. Now, what it really does is take all of the stuff that we're talking about and it converts that into a quote-unquote SQL statement that goes against your driver down to your data store. Even if that's multiple databases, Oracle, SQL Server, MongoDB, it really does convert that into a SQL statement that goes down to your database, allows the data store to do the work, and then comes back up in an already aggregated function in as many cases as possible. So it's very fast, very efficient, and we're continuing to work on that with every release. The layer that we're adding on today, primarily when we're talking about a deep dive into domains, we want to look at how we can program the domains, how we can add some functions into the domains. We're going to talk about security, but these same functions can be applied to calculations and in some cases to filters as well. So what we're doing today is really opening the door to how you can apply some programming to your domains in a few different areas. And again, we'll focus on security because that's the biggest area we try to do this, but it applies to other areas as well. Anytime you see that expression editor, what we do today will apply. So common use cases for domains are, of course, the self-service web reporting. And this is the first thing that most clients or prospects look at. They say, well, I want my customers to be able to go in and drag and drop fields and create their own tables, charts, crosstabs, right, pie charts, bar charts, whatever. And our domain designer, ad hoc designer, does a fantastic job of that. And you control what access they have, from what fields they can see, what columns they can look at, what rows of data they can see, down to what filters they have access to if you really want to. You have complete control over that. But at the end of the day, you give access to users to use the ad hoc designer. They can drag and drop from the 10, 50, 100 fields, 200 fields you give them access to. They're already joined. In a lot of cases, already aggregated. If they're not, you can give them access to create their own aggregations, or maybe they just want to create their own anyways. They can filter, group sort, you know, slice and dice in a variety of ways the data, how they want it, get a nice chart, get a nice table crosstab, and then they can export that, they can share it, they can schedule it, they can do all the things you're used to in Jaspersoft with typical reporting. There's very few limitations, if any, to what your users can do when you give them access to the ad hoc designer. So that's a typical use case. Say, we have some users, they know what they want, let's give them access to an ad hoc view. Maybe we've added a few fields to it for them by default. They can go in there, remove what they want, add what they want, do their own stuff, press save. They save it to their own location, their repository. They PDF it, they schedule it, they share it with everybody, and they're happy. That's a very good use case of ad hoc reporting. One of the things that comes along with that, though, is you say, well, I don't want them to get access to things they shouldn't have access to, and maybe I don't want to create 100 of these things. You know, I want to create a few of them, but I want to create 100 domains for every type of user. And the way we can do that is with securing our domains and limiting the domains. When we say security, it means a couple things. Maybe we talk about security in the form of authorization and, of course, authentication. Now, authentication's already been handled through Jaspersoft. Authorization's a big one. Maybe Alan, being the manager, is allowed to see salary information, but Jason, you know, I'm just a worker, I'm not allowed to see the salary field. We can do things like hide the field from Jason, or like Steve Park, one of our customer success reps, has done. He can actually make it so I can see the field, but it's all X's. I'm not allowed to look at it. Fun things like that can happen with decentralized security, and we're going to talk about how to do a lot of that today. Also, you can say, you know, Alan's able to see everything in EMEA, and Jason's only looking at stuff in North America. So we can do something like that and say, hey, if Jason logs in with this role or this attribute or this other field that I want to look at, he gets to see North America, and Alan gets to see EMEA. Same domain, update one file in the way we're going to do it today, and I have two completely different views of the data. And this can, again, go from hiding salary data or just limiting the data that I can see across the entire board. So column level and row level security, but it really encapsulates more than that when you look at what we're going to do today and writing some of these custom functions. The door's wide open with how you can use those two main concepts to expose your data in a variety of ways without having to recreate the domain, you know, I keep saying 100 times, but many, many times for those different use cases. Okay, so when we talk about domain mastership, we really, we like to laugh and say, well, we've used domains for years. We know, everything that's possible with domains. Well, we've added some things over the past, year, 18 months, maybe 24 months. I may not have touched it till the past year or so, but it's been added into the system for a while. We'll look at those at the end. But typically what we do with domains is we start out and we create some simple domains. We go in there and grab some fields. We say this is an area of expertise, a domain, and we want to grab all the accounting data, all the sales data, and we put it all into one domain area of expertise. And we throw it out to the users and say, here's the 100 fields that we're going to allow you to report on. Drag and drop all you want. Users come back and say, hey, there's another field I need. Can you add that in? We add those in, no problem. We move forward. Then we start to notice that users are using our domains in a certain way, or maybe they're asking for domain data in a way that isn't possible with our out-of-the-box, we'll say relational databases, knowing that domains can work against every different type of data store that I can think of. But I'll say relational databases. Maybe a relational database just doesn't contain the table that this individual wants to look at. This customer is a little more advanced, and they say, hey, I really want to look at my sales data like this. And the relational database just doesn't quite make that possible. That's when we go into a derived table. A derived table allows us to write, in many cases, a simple SQL statement, creates a brand new table, and I say that with quotes around it because it doesn't actually create anything in your system, of course. It's just all in the metadata. And the user says, hey, thanks, you created that table for me. How'd you do that? And well, it took me a lot of time and a lot of work, but truthfully, it took you the time to write a SQL statement to create a derived table. Then they come back and say, I'm constantly aggregating sales times cost, right, to get my cost of goods sold or something like that. And you go and create a calculated field for them. You publish that to the domain. They're happy. They got the field they want. Now, they could have done that themselves, of course, but you made it easy on them. You published a calculated field for them, all in the same domain, piece of cake. And then they come in, they say, you know what, I only work in the Northwest region of the United States maybe. Can you just give me a domain that only shows my region? So you create a new domain, you add a pre-filter to it that says Northwest region, and they're off and running. Now you've got a couple domains sitting out there. So then you have some new users that come on, and they come to you and say, well, these users, we really don't want them to see the sales data. We want them to see maybe the opportunities that are coming in, some things like that, but we don't want them to see the numbers. And that's when we start talking about security. And we say, well, certain users should have access to certain fields and columns, and certain users shouldn't. And the domain security file allows us to do that. And we're going to spend a lot of time in the domain security file, knowing that a lot of the advanced stuff that we can do applies there. The security itself is a pretty simple concept, right? We want to allow certain people access to things and restrict access for other people. So we're going to do that if we peek over here at the Groovy extensions. We're going to peek at the Groovy extensions to accomplish that, but we're going to apply it back to security. We could apply it back to pre-filters. We could apply it back to derived tables. We talked about localization a little bit. I'm not sure if it fits at the end or in the beginning, but localization is something that you either need or you don't need currently in your organization, right? We need to translate those fields, table names, et cetera, and we do that very quickly using our localization bundles is what we call them. And then, as I said, we get into calculated fields. This is where it gets a little bit more of a mastering domains. This is where we have to write a little bit of code. This is where we have to understand how to grab attributes from a user. If I want to limit Alan's access to data, I have to go look at Alan's user account and see what his properties say he should or shouldn't have access to. I don't want to hard code Alan's name into my domain security file. I want to go to Alan's user account and say, hey, well, what cities does he have access to? What warehouses does he have access to? I want that data, that list of cities or list of warehouses or favorite color, whatever it is, I want that to really come probably through my single sign-on process. And that's what we're going to work with today. The scenario we have today is we have a single sign-on that's passing in what warehouses Alan should have access to, and we're going to limit Alan's access to the data based on that information that's being fed to us by that external system. Now, I've actually hard-coded it in my system, of course. I don't actually have a single sign-on that's passing anything into me, but that's the idea. So the next thing is once we get those calculated fields, let's look at some more Groovy stuff we can do and how we can extend Groovy, make things accessible outside of just writing code inside the domain security file. And then finally, we'll talk about advanced joins and what's possible there. And that'll be kind of our, this is the next thing you should look at topic, is advanced joins. Groovy extension's pretty advanced. I think you'll like it. Advanced joins, I'm hoping today to expose you to the idea that they're possible. So just see a use for them in your organization, in your deployment of Jaspersoft. And then we can talk about that in a future section in depth. Okay, so let's jump into our topic one, and I've kind of covered this already a little bit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the scenario, but it's row-level security, and this is what most of us want to do in my experience with domains and securing data, but this is really, again, just to introduce the concept of writing some custom functions against our domains and how we can use those functions in different areas. Here's our simple scenario of some data. It isn't the real data we're working with, it's just an idea. We have John Smith. These are maybe sales individuals that work at different warehouses, and they have access to one or many warehouses, and those warehouses have a number of sales applies to those organizations. Now, we want to limit those based on a certain user attribute. So we're going to take away some items, and it looks like I forgot to highlight one of these guys here. Sorry about that. We want to take away some of those items. So Joe, customer, should only be able to see warehouse 11. So the top and the middle one there, not the number one there. I should have highlighted that in red. So that's the idea. And how we accomplish this is with the domain security file. And it could be as simple as going into the domain security file and say, hey, customer 11 gets to see warehouse 11, right? Something like that. But we want to make it a little bit more advanced. We want to make it a little bit more dynamic. And like I said, we're feeding this in from the SSO. So let's walk through that scenario a little bit. Here's what we want as far as our output goes. Select name, warehouse ID, sales from, salary table, where warehouse ID equals 11. Something like that. That's what we're going for. Okay, so let's go into the good part here. Oops. All right, so let's look at our actual setup. Probably just log out and log back in because I'm sure it's been too long. So I have a typical install. Jaspersoft in this case is 6.3. There's very little here that I've modified, and most of what I have modified I have a link to at the end of the presentation, so you can download and install this yourself if you really want to play with it. At least you can peek at the little bit of code that I wrote if you want to at the end. So let's take a look at that user first. Just to set up the scenario a little bit, I'm going to go to Manage Users at the top here, and let's look at this user. Now, I didn't actually use Alan, I used Chad. And I've created an attribute, and again, the idea is this is fed in from your single sign-on. So it's come from LDAP or maybe a custom single sign-on, something like that. And it's saying that Chad has access to these warehouse IDs. And the important thing to note here is that 11's missing, 24 is missing. It's 1 through 14, and I think I left off 11. Okay, so that's the idea is Chad has a custom attribute set by the single sign-on, and it says he's allowed access to these warehouse IDs. Now, if you've done this before, you know this is a little bit complex already because this is already a comma-separated list. So we probably have to parse that list, right, to do something with it. I can't just drop that into SQL and say where warehouse ID equals, because it'll say where warehouse ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. That's not going to work. So I have to do a little bit of work around that, and that'll kind of be our first scenario. How do I get this sort of, complex, let's call it, collection of values into my domain security file, and how do I apply that to my domain? So let's remember we have Chad. I'll come back to him in a minute and log in. I've got warehouse IDs, the case sensitive, of course, and I've got a comma-separated list of warehouse IDs. Let's go look at the simple domain that I've created. And I've already secured this one, but it shouldn't matter. I'm just going to edit it, and we'll look at kind of what fields I added and the possibilities there. So I edit that domain. Now I actually uploaded this with the domain designer, or with the an XML file here because I modified it manually. But if we go into the domain designer, it's still going to let me look at it. I haven't short-circuited anything. We look at all the tables I have access to. This is our Sugar CRM database, or our Food Mart database. So this is right out of the box. I've grabbed a couple tables here: inventory fact, time by day, warehouse. I don't have any drive tables in this case, but I could. Remember, I could just do the select star from table. It doesn't apply to this scenario, so I've skipped it. I've joined my tables as you expect. Nothing out of the ordinary here. I have one calculated field that I use in most of my demonstrations for this. I'll just peek at it just to show you how simple it is. But again, not really a big deal. one note, remember this is that expression editor that I refer to when we come back to it later. And then I don't have any pre-filters, and I think I've modified this display a little bit. So I've changed, maybe I've changed warehouse name. Yeah, there we go. So this is where we can do our localization if we wanted to. So that's kind of our setup. We got a user. Now I want to limit this warehouse ID for Chad. I want to apply that security. And the way I do it is a couple ways. There are a couple things I have to do. Number one, I've got a little folder here that I created for it. Here's the actual schema for the domain. The reason this is important is that I need to look at the schema to see what my join is called. And the way I get this XML file is I just hit export design at the top here. So right at the top, I export design. It'll download the XML file, and that's what we're looking at here. So let me open that up. I like to open it up in a text editor, of course, because we're going to need to know some things about this. Now, I've already done this, but we need to know some things about this. And the main thing we're looking at is what our join tree is called. It's almost always called join tree 1, the first one that you create. And I only really have one join tree. And then I also need to look through here, and you can tell this is all my warehouse data, this is all my fields, but I need to look in here and find what tables I have access to, right? And you see it's called inventory fact. I've got a couple others in here, time by day, and warehouse. So that's what I can work with when we look at our domain security file. So now I want to apply security to this, and the way I do that is with the domain security file. If I go back out to the resource that you all can download, there's a domain, deepdivesecurity.xml. The name of this isn't important. It doesn't have to match anything, but it's typically named something like this that matches the domain name underscore security, something like that. Now this looks somewhat complex, but this is like every example out there that you'll ever find that we create. So this is almost, you can copy and paste this from the web. In fact, this example is one of our examples on the web. If you go and Google that string, you'll find it, or very similar to it on the web. So the important part of it is very straightforward XML. I've made it a little bit larger, it's a little scrunched, but we have a couple pieces to it. A resource access grant, a grant list. It's telling me what do I have access to. I've given it it's giving it a name to it. So I've given it a good name, given a good label, and then what resource ID that I want to grant or deny access to. And here we go. Here's the ID for what I want to actually give access to or not. And here I check to see the principal expression is your condition. So it's saying, what are you basing your decision on whether you want to give access or not to this user? And the first thing I'm saying, hey, well, don't even apply this rule, this filter, if the user doesn't have an attribute called warehouse IDs. So the important thing that I would have to remember from a business rule is I need to make sure every one of my users, if they're going to use this domain, has a warehouse IDs attribute. If not, I would have to change my expression down here a little bit, which wouldn't be hard to do. But that's the first thing we're going to do. So my principal expression does a few things here that looks a little confusing. We'll talk about it for a minute. Authentication.getPrincipal.getAttributes. That's literally going to the principal object, which is the user. It's saying get all their attributes, and then it's doing a .any. And this is like an HQL expression, right? It's querying the object directly. And it says if there's any in it, check the name and make sure if it's warehouse ID. See if it contains warehouse ID. And there's some funny things to it. Inside of this any, we get this it object, and this it object contains any of the objects that came back from the query outside of it. So there's a little bit to look at there, but a lot of the examples are very, very similar to this. Now I'm looking at attributes here. So I'm looking at Chad's user attribute on his profile, but you could also be looking at role. So instead of get attributes, you could say, does Chad have the role supermarket manager? You'll see that in some of our examples. So a lot of possibilities there, and we have a ton of examples of different ways to do this. I think attributes is a good way to do a very custom rule. So that's why I stuck to it, but again, you have a lot of different options. Now the fun part. Here's the filter expression. The thing to remember about a filter expression on domains is this actually ends up going on to your where clause. So again, I'm talking in relational terms, but you can apply that, kind of how you want. But this is what ends up going on to your where clause. And what this does is it literally is going to take your warehouse IDs, it's going to split it into a collection, and it's going to make it like an in statement, right? So you see it's saying public inventory fact 1998 warehouse ID. Again, that comes from my domain schema. I could go look at that if I wanted to. Warehouse ID in, that's the field I'm going to limit. And then again, I'm going Groovy authentication, get principal, get attributes, find. Very similar to what you see above, but instead I'm finding the attributes. This becomes an attribute. It does basically an each, a for loop on those attributes. So does the attribute list contain warehouse IDs? In this case, it does. For every single one of those, I'm going to then split it apart because, again, it's comma separated. So I'm going to split it on the comma, and then I'm going to bundle them back up. And in this case, I kind of cheated. I think warehouse is actually a numeric, but I'm actually going to put them with single quotes around them. So I'm kind of cheating there, but this was a better example, frankly, and I didn't want to not have the single quotes because then you'll go to a string value there, and this is more complex. So it worked in either way, but just for full disclosure, if you're using numerics, you don't have to do a lot of the string concatenation here that you see me doing, okay? So that's our filter expression. Now this literally goes onto the where clause of my SQL statement, and if the user has warehouse IDs in their attribute list, they'll have this statement added on to their where clause. So you're assured that Chad is not going to see any warehouse IDs that don't match his warehouse IDs list. Now this is, so I take this domain security file and I upload it. I'm going to go back to the web. I didn't make any changes here, so I'll cancel. And I go over here to the security file in my domain definition, and I just hit upload. In this case, it says change, but there's a select button here normally. I find my file, and it does some validation. We're going to talk at the end some tricks that we can do to help with that debugging of your domain security file. But in this case, it does some validation, checks that domain security file against your domain schema. So if your field names are wrong or data types are wrong, things like that, it'll check, and it'll give you some feedback on the screen, and you can go and debug that. It is also in your log files, and we'll look at that at the end here. So there's a couple ways you can kind of dive into those expressions a little bit. Once I have that security file done, assuming I made it through any maybe typos I had or something like that, submitting my domain applies that domain security file. Now, we're not out of the woods yet. If everything's been done correctly, we've now secured that domain, and the user can use it. Let me go and create an ad hoc view as super user, and let's look at what data we have to start. So if I look at my deep dive domain, I get the fields we looked at. I'll just choose all of them so that way we're not spending too much time on the screen. I get my fields. I add, let me just make it quick here. I'll just add warehouse ID in, warehouse name. Let me add a filter on this very quickly. Right-click, create filter. And we'll see that warehouse ID has 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 10. There's 11, and all the way down to 24. So super user sees about 24 items. Go to manage users, and we'll log in as Chad and see what he has access to. And should miss 11 and then nothing greater than 14. I'll log in as user. I'll go back to create ad hoc view. I'll choose my deep dive domain. I'll add all of my fields. And once more, if I grab warehouse ID, and I'll throw something else up here. I create my filter. Again, just a quick way to look to see if this is doing what I want. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then I'm missing 11, and I don't see down to 24. So for column level and row level security, this is how you apply a domain security file. We had a couple pieces there, a little bit of code we had to write. We had to know what table we wanted to work with, what join tree this field existed in, where do we want the where clause to be applied. This where clause is going to be applied to that join tree, so the domain knows where to put the where clause when it actually builds a SQL statement. And then we had to know how to get the attributes from the user. So a bunch of pieces there. We applied it very simply, and this is why we call it proficient level. This is probably the level of 90% of our domain security files, limiting data by user, either column level or row level. This is row level security, by a user attribute or another field on the user. Okay, so that was our scenario one. Let me take a pause here and see. Let me check the WebEx. Alan, are you on the line yet? Is the audio resolved? Okay, I don't think so. Let me take a peek here. Okay, so let's see. I don't have questions. I think we'll save those till the end. If there are any questions on that, post them in the chat, and we'll get them at the end here. We definitely have time for it. And then let's move on to our next one if there's nothing from Alan or Amy. Okay, thank you for that, guys. Okay. So topic two, extensibility with Groovy. So we already looked at a Groovy expression, and you actually saw the word Groovy in there. Groovy was what we were using, the generic expression, to actually parse that user attribute, right? It actually went inside the generic Groovy extension, which I'll show you, or a function, which I'll show you what it does. But remember, even that, I think, I didn't try it, but even that entire Groovy expression could have been dropped into the expression editor and utilized that way too. So it's very extensible. We can do a lot of stuff. So we could have taken that Groovy function. We see a very simple sales minus cost here. But we could have taken that Groovy extension and dropped it right into the expression editor and used that as maybe a calculated field or a display field, or like Steve Park did, and limit the user's access to seeing the field with X's or something like that. Along with the other functions, we have a bunch of other functions that are built in. Starts with, contains, concat, and test profile attribute, which we'll see. And then, of course, a bunch of other ones. So when we talk about documentation, I think Jaspersoft is fantastic at it. And the doc that most of this is contained in is our server user guide. It's also on the web, on our wiki, of course, and then the ultimate guide has a little bit as well. So let me just jump in and show you where this is at right when we start this next example. But the idea is here is, and we wrote this thing, that little chunk of code, which was, 3 lines of code, 100 characters, but maybe it was more complex than that in your scenario. You want to reuse that. You don't want to have it in 15 domain security files. I mean, if you have 5 domains, you want to secure them all in the same way, you want to rewrite that function even 5 times. Because if you make a mistake or you need to update it, you have to go through 5 domain security files and update it. It's just something we'd like to avoid. So what if we could take that function and encapsulate it into a reusable function that we can use, throughout versions of Jaspersoft, certainly. Very easy to update. It's all in one location. That sort of thing. Highly cohesive, loosely coupled. We want to make sure that function is loosely coupled, but also highly cohesive. It does one thing, it does it well, got a function into it, and we can call it from multiple locations. So let's do that. Knowing that what we're about to do allows us to call it from the expression editor, as well as using the domain security file. I'm going to do it in the domain security file, but again, it makes it available in more than just that one location. Okay, so we're calling this Groovy extensions. Again, let's call it maybe custom function, using Groovy, something along those lines. Jump back. And again, very heavy on the demo side, so, it's a deep dive, right? So this is what we're trying to do. I'm going to log out as Chad, because I'm going to use my other domain, and we already know Chad, it worked, right? The code we're writing works. We'll come back and make sure Chad gets what he wants in a minute. Okay, so we have same domain security file, same layout of domain, same Chad user with the same comma separated, but we want to get this guy, pretty much this function, or this expression, out of the domain security file because we want to apply it to more than one domain. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing to remember is all of our custom functions are held in what's called a semantic layer file, or what we call a semantic layer file. That file is the application context semantic layer.xml. Let me just, again, it's a deep dive. Let me show you where it's located. I'm going to go into my Tomcat 8 directory, my web apps folder, and Jasper Server Pro, and then my web IMF directory. I know it's a little bit small, these file names. This is being recorded. You can always zoom in later. Let's just suffice it to say it's inside of. Sorry about that one more time. I want to show you that location really well. There we go. It's in Tomcat, your web container, web apps, Jasper Server Pro, Web INF. That's where we're at right now. And when I look in here, I've already sorted it by date because I modified mine last night at 6 p.m. If I go into this file and edit with Notepad, I actually have it open already, we see at the very top here, it's an XML file like most of the configuration files are. And we have a bunch of different, functions in there. You can already start seeing java.text simple date format, right? Things like that are there. Semantic layer factory, just a placeholder. We got some easy XML stuff in here. You start scrolling through and you say, wait a minute, this thing's like, 2,000 lines long. It's 1,973 lines long. I counted them last night, one by one. And you get some fun stuff in here that looks, rather confusing. Some stuff for 5.7, some legacy stuff we're holding on to. But if we scroll down, we start to get to a section that's actually for each different type of database. So we're getting a Groovy runner here. I'm just going to scroll through it because I think this is what most of us will do a week, a month, a year from now when we come back to this topic. JVC table from template, DB server type factory. Here we go. Here's our server types. Now we're getting to some stuff that makes sense to us, right? Postgres, SQL Server, Azure, DB2, Ingress. Right, so if we keep scrolling down, here's some fun stuff. This is what we're looking for. Our first is our default SQL generator. This is our default SQL generator. This is one that applies if no other no other Oracle, SQL Server, etc., Ingress function exists for the function we're using in Expression Editor. This is where we define special functions for use inside the Expression Editor. So we can use it in domain security files, or we can use it inside of the expression text box that we see on the screen. And there's more places than that, but that's a couple of them. Let me just scroll down and find a couple. Before date, here's a fairly complex one, but it's before date, right? We want to say is before this date. And it says we got some Groovy in here, right? Define is a Groovy method. It says, okay, so we get Java class. We're passing in 2 arguments, it looks like, before the date, and it says, we got some calculation on what format we're in, then it goes and gets a date range, and then it actually gets, does date not equal null, then date start, right? So it's just a little bit complex. There's a little bit of stuff we have to learn here. In fact, it looks like I need to look at this a little bit closer because this looks interesting to me. But we're returning basically a less than symbol, right? The date, and then the date type if we have to do any sort of calculation on it. That's really what's coming out of this. Let's get a couple more. If we scroll down, we see is null, string to int, is value, fun stuff like that. The comments are nice to read. You can see some of the thought process behind the case statement, for instance, multiple types of case statements. So we have several in here. One's called case, one's called case one, depending on what the DB type we're looking at. Let me scroll down a little bit more and show you. Here we go. Now we have one specific for Oracle. And because Oracle has certain ways of doing certain things, their wildcard characters different, fun stuff like that. They have timestamps. They have join statements that include the pipe, right? So we have to do different things for Oracle. If I scroll down just a little bit more, you'll see Postgres and so on and so forth. So let me just stick with that and say, if you want to create a custom function, a custom way of doing something, and in fact, at one point we found one of the Oracle ones was doing a fun thing with dates. So if you wanted to adjust how this worked with dates, maybe you wanted your time function to do something different. You could adjust this and do something different with it. If you want to create your own, you can put it in here, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to go back up to line 400. This is in the link that you're going to get at the end of the session here. It's actually in the PowerPoint, but it's downloadable as well. All this is in a GitHub repo for you. But about line 400, I created a function called parse CVS to in, which is, I'm not very creative. So it literally means we're going to parse comma-separated values to an in statement, right? And it's almost the exact same function we had in our previous example. If you look, it's slightly different in that it says, I get the attribute name, right? that I want to pull. So I have to call, the attribute name was warehouse IDs. I want to make this generic. Maybe your company isn't going to call it warehouse IDs. Maybe you're going to call it product IDs or customer IDs. Then you can make it generic. Which field am I working on? I have to pass that in. Category, of course, it's going to do a little parsing on it, so I know how to break it apart. And then I say I want to see how many of them there are is what that's doing. And then I have almost my exact function here. Almost exact function. Test field in. So remember my other one just had it hard-coded here. It said, let me just go back and show you. My other one said public inventory fact in. So test field in, and then I split it apart just like you see before. In fact, split, collect, trim, join. If I go back to my security file, split, collect, join, and then I did a little extra replacing on this one. I actually changed a little bit. And if there isn't enough value, so if I don't have enough attribute, if the attribute didn't exist, I said, you know, what if the user doesn't have that attribute? I don't want to even apply this function to it. Well, my domain security file handles that for me, but my code might break, right? I want to protect myself from that code breaking. And since I've abstracted this, I don't know if the consumer, I don't know if the person using my new function is going to put that check into their domain security file like they should, or like I think they should. So instead, I'm going to make sure my code won't break and just make sure the attribute exists. So if the attribute doesn't exist and they still try to use my function, I'm going to say 1 equals 1, and they're going to get all the data back. Hopefully they're debugging this and they're looking and they're not going to give access to data that they shouldn't see, but you could also do this. If you want to say, hey, if you use this function and you haven't set it up properly, I'm going to give you no data back, and 1 equals 2 essentially will do that. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. If not, let's ask some questions about it. Please put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. But this is my application context semantic layer file. Now again, this is a deep dive, so I'm going to lay this out for you. This file does change typically, or can change, from version to version. So the reason we want to be careful about this file is that I can't just take this file and apply it to a 5.6 install of Jaspersoft. Believe me, I've tried in various ways, and I've realized that you can't do that because I've forgotten or did it by accident. You have to actually come in here and copy and paste what you've changed to the new install. Or at least that's my suggestion, because or do a comparison on it at least, right? Do you know, some sort of comparison tool to see are the files the same or not, if you want to. What I say is keep track of your changes, do your comparison, however you want to do it, and then I would take your changes from, let's say this is a 631 file, and apply it to that next version file when you do the upgrade or whatever it is. Okay, so that's why, along with the domain security file, we don't want to have code floating everywhere. We want to consolidate it, and this is where this code goes, application context semantic layer. Sorry. Okay, so once this is done, I have a new function called parse CVS to in, which is a fantastic name. I'm going to go to a new domain deep dive security file that I created. I named it version 2. I know it's hard for you to see. It's in that same folder. It'll be part of the downloads that you have. And what I've changed from the other file we were looking at is I've called my function. Again, the point of this is how straightforward and easy it is to then, once you decide what you want to do, make it extensible and make it reusable. Now I can take parse CVS to in, and I can put it inside of my expression editor if I want to do it directly in a calculated field, if that made sense. This one doesn't necessarily make sense for that, but I could. But I can also use it in multiple domain security files in this case if I want to, and that's what I'm doing here. So I still have my same filter here. Again, this is what I'm relying on to make sure the attribute is actually there. If not, my code does now handle that. I have to pass in 2 things. The first one was the name of the field. You notice how that does not have quotes around it. That becomes my SQL arg0. And then this one has quotes around it, and it's the arg0. So this is the first argument. Just a little bit of distinction there between the 2. And that's what you see in my code, and that's how I go get that same exact code, basically replaced what I had there with a little bit of Groovy definitions and if statement around it. Same process applies. So just to kind of come full circle, again, I've got my Chad user. If I go back to view repository, again, I go back to my same domain. I literally copied and pasted this domain in the UI here last night. I apply my domain security version 2 by uploading it. I didn't change my design at all. So if I go back to manage users, log in as Chad, create an queue. I'll choose my deep dive domain number 2. Again, I'm just quickly choosing all the fields because this is the purpose of it. And if I grab my warehouse ID, I'll do warehouse name again, and then let me just add that filter just to prove that it did actually filter it again. Is one of, and we get our nice 13 items, missing number 11 and nothing greater than 14. So now I have a reusable function that I can use in more than one place. Again, it can go in the expression editor. This should show you that Groovy isn't limited to what you have on the server. Groovy, if you wanted to, can make web services calls. Groovy can go out to other locations and look things up. I'm looking at profile attributes, which is fairly complex. But this should show you that once you're in that Groovy method here, just go back to it. Once you're in this Groovy method here, or directly in the code in the security file, you can do anything Groovy is possible. And it's a very powerful language. It's very, Java familiar to us, so we're, it's not something that it's a steep learning curve to get over. There's some nuances to it. There's still more I have to learn about it, of course. But it can do a lot here. So your doors are wide open for not only what we can do with a domain security file, but if we put this in the expression editor, what we can do to transforming fields and creating custom fields or looking up field names, that sort of thing. And as I said, Steve Park's doing a lot of work in that area right now, part of our team. Okay, so that was our example on Groovy extensions, and we call it that because we actually create a custom function. And then we looked at the other functions that are already built into this file. Remember, I scrolled down, I looked at Oracle, and we looked at Postgres and how it has special time functions and things like that. If you see something you don't like or you want to adjust, this is probably the file that applies to a domain SQL statement where it's being generated. So you want to come back here. And again, this is in the WebINF folder underneath your distribution. It's already there by default. Okay, so let me go back to the PowerPoint. We had one more thing to talk about, and that's virtual domains. And I'm going to leave a couple minutes for questions as well. But virtual domains allows us to very quickly take more than one data source. And this is a new feature we're pointing out because you may not have experienced it. More than one data source and apply it to a domain. So I can take a SQL Server data source, an Oracle data source, a big data data source, and I can apply a domain on top of that. So I'm going to do that by going to create data source. I log back in as super user. And it'd be interesting to know how many of you didn't realize this was here or this is new to you, but you really, it's right here at the bottom. I've added another one, but virtual data source. And it literally asks you, okay, well, what two data sources do you want to combine? And I can go through my samples, look at my data sources, and I can grab my Food Mart, JNDI, just for example, and I could grab my crimes little sample that I pulled in, and I can combine those two into one data source. I can rename them. Once this is a data source, I can create that very quickly in a domain. Nothing I've showed you can't apply once I've done this next step. So there isn't much more to show you other than create the two data sources, one for SQL Server, one for Oracle, or whatever two data stores you have, or three. Create the data source, go into domain, point at that data source, and you're off and running. And very few limitations therein. I've seen very few issues with it at all. If you do play with it, please reach out and let us know how it goes, because this is finding a lot of success in the marketplace, simply for the fact that I can take my main data store and then maybe this ancillary data my customer gives me, maybe through a web service or something, and I can combine those into a domain and then start doing reporting off them very quickly without having to pull their data in or do some sort of ETL process. This makes it very quick for me. Of course, the performance impact is fairly obvious. I'm pulling from two different data sources, so you're going to have to wait a little bit for each one of those depending on how long they take. If one's slower than the other, you're going to wait for the slowest one, but it's no different than going against the two data sources individually. The system itself doesn't necessarily slow you down at all. So that's our virtual data source. Again, not really deep dive, but exposing you to it, something you may not have touched on. And then finally, a few things to look at when you're having trouble. number one I did was check the logs. Of course, the domain designer pops up. I didn't have any issues because I've worked through them, but the domain designer will pop up and tell you, hey, you got a field name wrong, or this field wasn't found, or something like that. But also check the log files. And to quickly jump to those, if I go back to my Tomcat directory, Web Apps, Jasper Server Pro, and if you look in the logs directory, I'm sorry, WebINF, and look in the logs directory, you have a Jasper Server.log, and this is literally where I look. So if you look here, I probably have some. What did I do here? Well, we'll assume there's some in here that I created. I guarantee you these are mine, but I want to spend a lot of time looking at it. So there we go. And you'll see that I have a lot of debugging here, very verbose. Everything you see on the screen is also in there, but a little bit more detail. So check the log files first is my suggestion. Look at the Supermart samples. Not only the application context semantic layer has some great functions there already you can peek at, but look at the Supermart samples that are out there. We have some domains already that have a security file applied to them. In fact, the Supermart default domain or sample domain has a security file on it. That's a great starting example. Look at that, and then you can certainly copy and paste and apply it to your domain after modifying it slightly. In fact, that's what I did. That's what I always do. I always start with that sample because why bother starting out by typing XML by hand? And then finally, there's a Groovy tool validator. I have one that's just on the web that I use. But don't forget, Groovy is not a black box that you have to work into. There's a Groovy script editor. It's web-based. I plug my Groovy in there. It pops out what I want. The only caveat I'll say is that you won't have access to user attributes. So what I'll do if I want to test, let's say I want to test this guy in my Groovy function. You can see this is a Groovy function. If I want to plug this into my Groovy test tool, I'm not going to get this guy, right? I'm not going to get find attribute names, warehouse IDs. It's just not going to happen. That whole thing isn't going to be possible from a native Groovy app. So instead, I just fake it. I say, well, I know that's what my attribute is. So I actually take it like this and say .split. Now that's Groovyable. I can drop that right into a Groovy editor, and it's going to do the parsing for me, and it'll work because a string is a valid object to do that on. So some nuances like that to play around with will help you in your, starting out in Groovy, which I'm sure most of you have done Java a little bit will jump to it very quickly. Okay, so I know we're down to a minute or so. That is all the content we wanted to cover. We do want to go to questions here. While I do that, let me just pop up the more information. That way you can get to the documentation. Of course, the admin guide, the user guides, and every one of our installs. You all have access to it through support site as well. Our community wiki is fantastic. Just about every example we did here is already out on the wiki in some form or another. And like I said, I'd like to promote Steve Parks just published one that is very useful and very different than what I did, but very useful for column level hiding, let's say, or masking is what he called it. And I love that example. Everything we did in the webinar is on my GitHub repo. So github.com/jasonhuber/domains deep dive. It better be correct because I copied and pasted from the repo, so double check that. And then, of course, services and support. Our support team is here for you. I keep talking about Steve Parks' example. He's part of our customer success team. So reach out if you have issues, you have problems, get a ticket in, ask questions, make that phone call, and let us help you out for that. Let me jump back to the questions. Oops, I didn't mean to actually jump back to the questions. I'll leave that up, and let me go back and look if I have any questions in the chat here. Okay, so questions are coming in. Thanks for attending. I see some of you are dropping off. Please feel free. I'm going to answer the questions as they come in. We'll hang out a little bit longer. We're going to have our next deep dive webinar will be posted. You all will be notified in the same way that you were this time. So if you're here this time, you'll be notified in the same way. So thanks again. And again, I'm going to hang out for whatever questions we have on the list, and I'll start answering those in a moment. Okay, here we go. Awesome. Okay, so there we go. I got the questions up. Let me just make sure I can see them a little bit larger here. Thank you for that, Amy. Okay. All right. Oh, my Q&A, you got them. Okay, that's good. Audio, everyone, slide issue. Okay, I'm just trying to find the first question. Here we go. Awesome. How does a principal expression differ from attribute service get attribute field name null? Mike, if you're still on, sorry about that. It took me a minute to scroll down. Thank you for that, Amy and Alan. The principal, so attribute service get attribute, I believe, was deprecated. Don't quote me on that, and I didn't try it because I just grabbed the latest one. You know, but I believe the attribute service was deprecated. But let me make sure to research that. What I would suggest is to try it. In fact, I'll try it when we're done here and see what it is. But it doesn't differ at all in functionality because I have used that in the past. I believe the way I showed you is the newer version of traversing. If you remember, we in 6.1.0, I believe, or 6.0, we went to Spring Security 3. Just after 6.0. So I believe that's when that break took place, or that change took place. But again, don't quote me on that. I believe that's the case. How do we capture user ID inside a derived table like PPM user and JS Studio reports? Good question, Raghu. I think anytime you see that expression editor, I believe you can throw that application context in there, or the expression. So the same thing that Mike was asking, I believe you can throw that expression in the expression editor. In the drive table designer, however, that might be a limitation. So my next thought would be to, and I don't have an example in front of me, my next thought would be to create a calculated field that is that expression, and then take that expression and apply it to the derived table, if that makes sense. So take that calculated field and put it in the derived table. I'm not 100% if that would work, but that would be my first way to jump to placing the user ID inside of the derived table. But there are a couple other ways to do that. Is that pure Java inside the value nodes of application context? No, that's, Mike, that's a Groovy function, although Groovy does have the ability to, it gets compiled up to Java code. So Mike, it does have the ability to, there's a generic Groovy function that you can pass just about any Java to inside that file. And that's kind of what you saw when I had just Groovy parentheses. It's just being evaluated. And you can do a lot of Java inside of there. So I'm not sure exactly what you're trying to do, but it's probably possible by doing that, as long as you're not going outside of the core libraries, because I don't know if you have the ability to throw includes in there and that sort of thing. That said, you can call your own library that way as well. If I had encapsulated this into a JSON.jar, I could call that from inside that semantic layer. You would, yes. So Milan, you asked, do we have to copy and paste the parse CVS to in if we upgrade? Yes, you do. And that's really why we put in that file. That's a file that all of us know we touch, or it gets touched very often. And those files are what we consider safe to touch, in that we always look there for when we upgrade. It's very common for us to see things in that are changed, so we're well aware of that. So if you talk to support or customer success or professional services, we'll know to look in those files and say, oh, okay, it's probably in this file over here, because it's common for you to modify those files. So you do have to touch it to upgrade. It does have a slight impact, but it's an area we consider safe to touch because of that. We're very well aware that those things are touched. The semantic layer does apply across organizations as well. So yes, you can apply an application context semantic layer. It applies to the server itself. No, you can't apply that to organizations, although there's nothing stopping you from inside that function checking the org name. and even going out to some other location saying, hey, is this org name part of this other list? So should this function apply in this way or that way? So you can't apply a function in the semantic layer to an org only. You can do that to a security file, or just give the domain to only that org. But inside the function itself, it can check the org that the user is part of. Remember, you have the entire user there, so you know what user is. So you can do it the reverse of what you're asking. I think that's Kevin there. So you can do the reverse of what you're asking to achieve the same goal, but I don't think you can't apply semantic layer to anything but the entire server. Okay, so a problem with left joins. Martin, I'm not familiar with that one on the virtual data source. If you could publish it or contact support with it, or send it to me. If you can't do that, send it to me, jhuber@TIBCO. I'd love to hear more about it. But no, definitely not. I've used virtual data sources in every permutation that I can think of. I can't say I haven't run into any issues at all, but nothing that's been a stopper like what you're suggesting with a left join issue. So that might be something we could, look at the log files, debug, that sort of thing, to see what's going on with it. But no, it should not be an issue, Martin. Thank you for that. Ken, anything changing in 6.4? Lots, but not something that I'm prepared to speak about. Tom Tortolani has done a few roadmap examples and demonstrations as well, and we're all looking forward to it. Elisa, thank you for that. The security guide does cover domain security as well. You're absolutely right. One more here. Okay, so last one, Wenjing, is it possible to dynamically set the table in the domain? For example, use some placeholder in the domain to determine the table at runtime of ad hoc view. Something tells me you're working with the current SC because we're currently working on a solution to do something just like that. So if that's the case, then good on you for asking the question, and a fantastic question. The scenario really is, for everybody still on the call, we want to have a domain that has maybe dynamic tables or dynamic fields. And, out of the box, well, no, the fields have to be determined. The fields have to be picked. Again, that said, Steve Park, I keep going back to Steve because he even replied to this late last night. Steve Park's example of masking a field applies to that scenario. If let's say you know the number of fields that differ, or at least the potential number of fields that differ, and this is a very quick way of addressing your concern, you can apply, you can do a lookup to see what fields are there and then apply those as custom fields. It's not a placeholder, it's kind of a placeholder, but it's not really a placeholder in that you can replace the text or copy and paste. And the domain security file only applies to the where clause. I've tried to apply it to other locations, and that can't be done but without modifying the actual underlying code for Jasper Server itself. So Wenjing, possible, we're looking at solutions for that. And if you're working with Bing, she is currently working on an area around that right now, which is, I think she's going to find a pretty good way around it. So please reach out to us on that. If you're not working with Bing, reach out to me and let's talk about it more, and I'll see what I can tell you about it, what they've done. But certainly something that is top on our radar because it's come up a couple times. Is there a way to apply security to data sources like with domains? Not currently, Kevin, but remember your data sources are completely customizable, Kevin. So in your connection string for your data source, when you're creating a data source and you from scratch and you put in server name, port, and you put in username, password, all of those are parameterizable now. They have been since, I think, 6.1 or 6.2. So what you could do is apply that security on your, let's say your RDBMS, like SQL Server, and then just change the connection I'm using to connect in, if that helps you. That gets you a little bit closer to what you're looking for, but you still got to talk to your DBA to do it, and that might be the issue. So you can't apply security files to data sources like I did with domains, but you can accomplish something similar if you remember that data source is parameterizable. So you can do the $P in your data source definition, and just in the UI. You just do it right in the UI. So hopefully that opens a door for you. It doesn't address exactly what you're asking, but hopefully it opens a door for you. Muna, yes, absolutely. I chose attribute because it's a little more complex, but role is very common. There's plenty of examples in there, and it's very similar code. except for you're looking at role rather than attribute. I think it's literally role rather than attribute. And then the roles don't have commas in them probably, right? But Muna, absolutely, you can apply security to a role rather than to a attribute. And Mike, yeah, Mike followed up with you. Thank you for that, Mike. It does work. So the possible dynamically set the table. Wenjing, again, thank you. No, I think I answered that. Not that I know of dynamically, but we do have a couple ways around that. Hopefully you'll reach out to me. And again, it's jhuber@tibco.com. And then we can talk about it a little bit more because that's an interesting area for me. And I know Bing is working on it as well as Steve is jumping on a little bit. So, okay. Amy, Alan, anything else before we conclude? Just let me know in chat, I guess, since I seem to have disconnected you. Okay. Thank you, everybody. At this time, we're going to stop the recording and disconnect the WebEx. I appreciate you attending the first deep dive. Certainly, domains was a good topic for it. Again, look for that email for the next one coming up. It'll be just as interesting or better, I'm sure. Thanks a lot.